7 of the top 14 AP ranked teams in college basketball are in the SEC, including one who is in action tonight against a blue blood.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton, joined today by our regular guest, Leaf Thulin, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content Monday through Friday, 52 weeks out of the year. We are here for you all of the time. I want to give a special shout out to our everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us on the Locked On College Basketball Discord channel, and remind you all that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and if you win, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, Leaf and I are going to discuss the AP poll. We're going to talk about Leaf's top 25 rankings, how they differ from the AP poll, including why there's a large gap between Oregon and UCLA, despite a result that happened last week that shows a little bit differently. We're also going to preview 7 marquee matchups tonight, including a pair of Big East games and a very fun one in the Jumpman Invitational. But we start our conversation talking about the AP top 25. Not a ton of movement, particularly at the top. You still got the same top 5, Kentucky and Duke just flipped, which I'm sure made a lot of Kentucky fans feel happy after being behind one spot behind Duke, despite beating them in a head-to-head. And while head-to-head matchups should not be the sole determining factor, as somebody pointed out on social media, nobody's upset that Clemson's not ahead of Kentucky because they shouldn't be ahead of Kentucky. But it did still feel like Kentucky probably deserved to be one spot ahead of Duke in those rankings. The biggest riser in the AP top 25, was UConn, who went from 18th to 11th. Very understandable after beating Gonzaga at the Madison Square Garden. They moved one spot ahead of Gonzaga, who was not the biggest faller, but they did fall down to 12, I believe is where they fell to 13. UConn is at 11, so they moved 2 spots ahead of Gonzaga in that situation. UCLA was one of the bigger risers, although arguably not enough. They moved up 6 spots to number 18, while Texas A&M took a nice jump up to number 12 after beating Purdue, one of the many wins for the SEC over this past weekend. The biggest faller was Michigan, 14th to 24th after losing to Arkansas. Felt like a bit of a sharp drop for the Wolverines, but realistically, all the teams in that kind of 16 to 25 range feel fairly similar. So losing to a tough team like Arkansas is enough for Michigan to fall as much as they did. Clemson, similar situation. They lose at home to Memphis. Not a terrible loss, but also not a great loss for the Tigers. They dropped from 16 to 25. Leaf, looking at the AP poll, and we'll get into some of the discrepancies that your top 25 has with the poll, but is there anything that really jumped out to you as either surprising or frustrating or anything that you just kind of wanted to make a comment on?
Well, I always feel like the AP poll does something where recency takes the cake no matter what. Yeah. And then the next big thing is, if you've beaten one good team and that good team's better, that one win carries you for quite a while.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see in future reference that UConn and Gonzaga, if they're ever ranked next to each other, are going to have that hold over their heads, like Duke and Kentucky, like you mentioned in the outset. You're going to see that between Duke and Auburn maybe at some point. If Auburn loses in SEC play and Duke dominates the ACC like I expect, maybe that'll be a point of contention. But I think that's kind of silly because games happen. They're one-off. We're ranking which teams are better. So I think there should be a poll of, okay, who deserves it based off their resume, and then who do we actually think are the best teams going forward? And I try to do more of the latter, where I try to do more of, okay, this is the team I believe is actually better than the next team. And I rank it best team to worst team. And then I'll give some respect to results, of course. Like I can't make up the stuff. But I think too many people, I think there's only 3 people in all of America that voted for Auburn to be the number 1 team. Like Why? Auburn's been great. They just beat Ohio State by 1,000,000.
Yeah.
Their only loss is losing at Cameron Indoor to arguably the most talented team in college basketball. So I have Auburn 1. I mean, there's plenty of discrepancies between mine and that, but that's my overarching thought in terms of how the AP poll conducts itself.
Yeah, I also have Auburn 1, so we're in agreement on that, even if most of the AP voters are not. And what I think it is voters, they had Tennessee 1 last week, and they don't feel like they can move Tennessee down because they didn't lose, even though Tennessee needed a game winner to beat Illinois, who is a good team, who you have ranked higher than the AP poll. But it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, if Jordan Gady missed that lay-in, or if one other possession went differently and Tennessee doesn't win that game, Auburn is probably I would venture a guess they might be the unanimous number 1 team in college basketball by the AP voters. But the fact that one shot went in, one result was slightly different than it could have been. Meanwhile, Auburn was never in any danger of losing to Ohio State. I don't think it's a big deal. I don't think Auburn being at 2 is catastrophic, but it's not how I would have voted. And obviously in your situation, the same as well. So I want to pick the 4 teams here, Leaf, that you are 5 spots or more different than how the AP voters voted, and then kind of just let you talk about which of those you feel the most strongly about. And I think the top one is the one that probably most fits what you were just describing, of you wanting to vote based on who you think are the better teams, not necessarily based on their resume or their wins and losses, because you have Houston at 8, whereas the AP poll has fairly consistently kept Houston right around 15, in this case exactly at 15. So that's a 7-spot difference. You have Dayton at 15. The AP voters have them at 22nd. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there. Again, like I said, I think a lot of those teams are kind of bunched together. You had Illinois at 19. The AP did not have the Fighting Illini ranked. And then Oregon, and I want to talk about the Oregon UCLA thing a bit, but you had Oregon at 20. The AP voters still have the Ducks at number 10. Any of those in particular you want to kind of address why you felt differently than the AP voters?
Yeah, I'll start with Houston. Houston, to me, has an incredibly high floor. I've always been consistent year after year that I think Houston's one of the best floors, but I question their ceiling. This year, I was particularly questioning their ceiling because they lost Jamal Shed, who I think is the best player they've had. You can make an argument for Marcus Sasser, but Jamal Shed, I thought, mattered more. First team All-American, Defensive Player of the Year, all these things. They lost him, and it's all culture, but you need the Jimmies and the Joes, not the X's and the O's, and Kelvin's got these guys who play great defense. They've got great grit. And you may say, well, you're supposed to be defending top 8. I am. The thing is, they're a top 8 team because their floor puts them as a team that you can most bank on to make a Sweet 16. So if that means you pick them at 15th, I don't think you could say even teams that are ahead of them, Florida, who may have a higher ceiling, you'd actually confidently pick, despite their unblemished record, to finish as a safer bet to make the Sweet 16. I think that's a little presumptuous. But look at the numbers. I'm not even the biggest analytics guy. I love the eye test. But the numbers would dictate that Houston is the 3rd best team on defense, which is no surprise. That might even be lower than you anticipate, but also the 11th best team on offense. And this is a team that I think is fairly anemic offensively. So if I say that they're worse than that offensively, but they're top 12 offense, top 11 offensively, top 3 defensively, and their losses are against good teams. I mean, Auburn, we were just singing their praises. San Diego State's a very difficult matchup for Houston because they are basically carbon copies of one another in the way that they want to play. And you look at that, and I think that makes it out to be a better team. Their resume, I don't even think is 15th best in the country, though. Like, if you were to look at their resume and record, it's not great, but you've got to watch them play and know what their program's about.
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment. I think it's accurate. I think there are AP voters who are ranking Houston higher than maybe the resume would suggest, like you have them here. But ultimately, it just feels like a team that's so safe and secure in the style that they play and the talent they have. It's maybe not as much as it's been in the past, but it's still enough for them to be a top 2-3 team in the Big 12 and legitimately contend to be back in the Sweet 16 like they've been so much regularly. And want to move on, though, and talk about the UCLA and Oregon side of things. And to me, it's just one-off results should not be the primary determining factor for how the AP votes. We've talked about that already today. We've talked about that in the past. But UCLA went on the road to beat Oregon. Oregon lost at home to UCLA. It's Oregon's only loss, and I think Oregon has better wins than UCLA. I don't think that's really even that debatable at this point. But to me, it just feels like them being this far apart just doesn't sit right with me, and it doesn't sit right with the other metrics that a lot of folks use here. KenPom has UCLA at 13th. And I believe Oregon is like 17th or 18th at KenPom right now. The net is very similar. UCLA is also 13th at the net. I think Oregon is 17th there. So they're ahead of them in the net. They're ahead of them at KenPom. They both have one loss. UCLA's loss is to New Mexico, which is a worse loss than Oregon's, which is, of course, to UCLA. But UCLA lost to New Mexico in the second game of the season. It was November 8th, really early in the year for a roster that's completely overturned. Like, I just don't find that New Mexico loss that concerning for UCLA, not in the same way of, I mean, they beat Oregon on the road, they beat Arizona in Phoenix, and yes, and I know you have thoughts on this, Leaf, but Arizona has not played particularly well. Tommy Lloyd has been really struggling with the club that he has this year. It's been a surprising turn for this program, but UCLA still went out and not only beat them in Phoenix, but just completely imposed their will on that game. They played their style. Arizona was forced to adjust to them. Like Mick Cronin, when he's got the personnel that fit his system, is really dangerous. And I think all of this to say, we may feel like UCLA is not being appreciated the way that they should right now, but the ball is in UCLA's court because they play North Carolina on Saturday. And then next Saturday, the 28th, they play Gonzaga. You win both those games, you're no longer having to have any kind of conversation about whether you should be a top 10 team because you unquestionably will be at that point. You lose both of them, then we're having a different conversation. If you split them, then we'll see kind of what happens from there. But this UCLA team, I feel like, is not getting the respect they deserve right now from the AP voters, where I think Oregon's resume is maybe being propped up a little bit, and we'll see what Dana Altman's club can look like later in the season. But I was surprised to see the discrepancy between those two in this poll.
I'm with you. And the funniest part is I feel like I'm flip-flopping. I was like absolutely frustrated by the way UCLA played against New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I held it against them for
Sure.
the next two polls.
Mm-hmm.
But the funny part is when I did my preseason predictions for each league, these were my two teams that I thought were the best in the Big Ten, but I was questioning, can they win the Big Ten, having to do all those road trips, having to travel across the country that often. But I like their rosters the most and the way they fit their respective coaches. But UCLA deserves to be ahead of Oregon because Oregon somehow moved up after losing a game. They're number 12 last week after being undefeated. So somehow they moved up 2 spots by losing at home. Like, what on earth is happening?
Yeah.
Like, that feels like a lack of homework being done by voters.
Yeah.
And here's the other part. Oregon has beaten good teams. They eked out a win against Alabama. They beat Texas A&M from behind. They beat San Diego State, where they also trailed early in that game. Those are really good wins. And those were neutral sites, and I would argue that some of those teams didn't play that well. But they also have had to come from behind against really bad teams. And so their entire body of work, though unblemished up until that game, kind of led to what you saw against UCLA, a game where they were outplayed throughout, eked ahead, and then honestly got unlucky with a bank shot 3. But UCLA may not be aesthetically pleasing, but you know the product is extremely consistent and difficult to be. It's similar to Houston. It's similar to San Diego State in that regard. And they have a few more horses, at least different guys that can do different things than San Diego State. I don't think they're as good as Houston, but I think they're in the same conversation. So UCLA to me is undervalued. And I think Oregon at 20 might be a touch low of me, but I just don't understand how the week gets rewarded for losing a game.
Well, you talked a little bit about Florida, and they remain undefeated. We're going to see what they look like getting into conference play. But before that, they're taking on a reeling but still very talented North Carolina club as part of the Jumpman Invitational. We're going to give you our thoughts on that matchup tonight and a few other games taking place. All that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, it is that time of year. The college football playoff is back, and with the newly expanded 12-team format, it is guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. TNT Sports' coverage of the college football playoff begins December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern time. That leads into our first matchup, SMU taking on Penn State at noon. Then the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the college football playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. All right, folks, segment 2. Still Andy Patton, still joined by Leaf Thulin here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. And we're moving away from our talk about the AP poll and the rankings to get you ready for what is a really fun Tuesday slate of games. We kind of talked last week, Isaac and I talked about how it was finals week for a lot of schools, and we just didn't see that many high-profile games Monday through Friday. Of course, that led to that massive day of fun games on Saturday. And this week, it's kind of the same, but we do have a few better days with some fun matchups during the week. And Tuesday here, we got quite a few good ones. We're going to talk about 3 games here in this segment. Then we're going to talk about a pair of Big East games and a couple other games to close out the show. Here we start North Carolina taking on Florida at 7 p.m. Eastern time at the Spectrum Center in Charlotte. This game will be on ESPN as part of the Jumpman Invitational. FanDuel currently favors the Gators by 3.5. We also got Clemson going on the road to take on South Carolina. That game is also at 7 o'clock on the SEC Network. FanDuel favors Clemson by 2.5. And then we're sticking with schools in the Carolinas. George Mason taking on Duke at Duke, also at 7 p.m. So you might have to triple screen this one. That's on the ACC Network. FanDuel favors Duke by quite a bit, 19.5. Leaf, let's start with North Carolina and Florida. Obviously, North Carolina is a blue blood, a highly regarded program. They were ranked well to start the season. They haven't really performed at expectation, lost some games they shouldn't lose, have been playing a lot closer games against teams they shouldn't even be playing close games against. We know the front court is a big issue for them. Meanwhile, the Gators have looked very, very good. To me, the fun matchup is the battle of the guards between RJ Davis, Seth Trimble, and Elliot Cadeau for North Carolina, and then Walter Clayton, Will Richard, and Elijah Martin for Florida. I think that's the most fun part of this game, but I think that the game is going to be one determined in the front court. What do you think about this matchup?
I agree with you. And let's just say the backcourts play even. Florida's front court's extremely ahead of North Carolina's.
Yeah.
I came into the year a little bit skeptical of North Carolina. I had them outside my top 10, which was lower than many. And pretty quickly, you saw, even against Elon the first game, you're like, well, they're getting out rebounded. Oh, wait, there's a 7'4" guy. Strangely enough, I played against him growing up. But but even then, I was looking at Matt Van Komen, and I was like, man, Matt Van Komen's beating North Carolina. Like, that can't happen. Yeah. And then it got worse and worse. You watch him play Kansas, and Dickinson had his way. Okay, whatever, it's Hunter Dickinson. But then you go to Maui, and everyone's killing them on the glass.
Yeah.
So I actually would say, and this is going to be a hot take to some, but I actually have been saying this for a while, that Walter Clayton's better than RJ Davis.
Okay.
Walter Clayton's better than RJ Davis. Elijah Martin's far, far bigger than Elliot Cadeau. And so if you're looking at the 2 main guards right there, he's better than Cadeau because he's bigger and he's off the ball because Clayton handles the ball handling, whereas Cadeau has to, and it takes the ball away from Davis. And then Will Richard is way bigger than Trimble. I love Trimble. Trimble, I think, may be better of those 2. But I would take Florida's guards, and I would say that Clayton's a more valuable player to his team, even though RJ was a first-team All-American last year. So I think Florida's going to win this game, and it might win convincingly, even though it's in Charlotte, which is obviously closer to the home of North Carolina, obviously within the state of North Carolina.
Yeah, I'm with you on a lot of this. I think Alex Condon's been playing some great ball in the front court for Florida. Ruben Chinyenlu, transferred from Washington State, has been a big piece as well. And we've really just seen Florida's bigs are very efficient. Like, they don't play 35 minutes a game. They each kind of play like 20, 25, somewhere in there, but they get it done. And when you look at North Carolina's front court, it's just not happening for them. They've kind of cycled out different guys. Cade Tyson had a great game against LaSalle. Great. That's good for him. He hasn't been playing well, but how much is he going to have an impact in this game where he's going to be exposed defensively? Jalen Washington, Jalen Withers, Van Allen Lubin, like those guys have had good games at times, but none of them have been consistent. And it just feels like, again, if you're Florida and you're told, hey, the guards are going to cancel each other out, I think you expect to win 9 times out of 10. And that's wouldn't be surprising to me if that's what ends up happening. And I think you mentioned the height in the backcourt, and I think that's a key factor too, as everybody talks about, North Carolina's size in the front court, but like they start 3 guards who are all undersized, and it works for them against certain opponents, but it can be a challenge against teams with bigger backcourts, and Florida kind of perfectly embodies that with the trio that they have. So I'm with you. I think Florida wins. I would probably take the over on the The spread there, 3.5 is what it has at FanDuel right now. I think Florida wins. I think they win by more than that. And I think that helps kind of, I know Florida's a top 10 team in the AP, but they're not getting a ton of national attention, in part because they're like the 5th best team in the SEC, which says more about that conference than anything else. But I think this is a win that could potentially put Florida more on the national radar and continue to have people be real concerned about what it means for the Tar Heels.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. And the other thing about Florida that many people don't know is they play like a quartet of bigs. So even if one guy doesn't have a great game, Condon is the best of those bigs. But Sam Alexis and Tommy Hawk are both really good players, and all of them are better than any big on North Carolina.
Yeah,
And
I'm with you.
It's just not a normal thing to say. North Carolina usually employs 4 bigs of their own. Like a couple years ago, they had Daron Sharp and Walker Kessler saddled on the bench. Both of those were 21st and 22nd pick, respectively.
Yeah.
So the tides have turned. I think Florida is good. I think this is their first actual quality opponent in terms of having true high major upper echelon players at a position, but it's an incomplete team in North Carolina.
Yeah, I would agree with that. 2 more games to talk about here. Clemson at South Carolina and George Mason at Duke. I think with George Mason at Duke, they're favored by 20. I think they're going to win by 20 plus. It's not a super exciting game. I don't dislike this George Mason team, but they have some ugly losses. They lost to Central Michigan. They lost to East Carolina. Their other loss is Marquette, which is not a bad loss. But Duke should handle this one. They should handle it fairly convincingly. Is there anything in particular you want to see from Duke, you expect to see from Duke, or are you just kind of expecting this to be a, hey, we're going to roll over this team and the Cameron Crazies are going to be bored by the under 12 in the second half?
I want to see Duke's point guard evolution. Like Sion James has started some, Caleb Foster started others. I want to see how they continue to improve and make life easier for Con Knippel, and how the shooting continues, because I mentioned this at the outset of the show. I think they're the most talented team in the country, and it's not just the Cooper Flags there. Like usually they do have the best freshmen, but it's not that this year. It's that their team actually makes sense. I don't feel like they're shooting well, but their defense is putting up unbelievable numbers. Yeah. So they have a higher floor than typically some of these teams do, and their ceiling is championship good. So I just want to see some of those loose edges start to be trimmed, and then it'll be interesting to watch what KD Johnson does for that side, because he is nicknamed Nightmare Fuel. And I'm sure he'll have some interesting plays against a very stout defense.
Yeah, KD Johnson is far and away the thing I'm most interested in this game as well. So I'm glad that you brought him up. Last game here before we move on to talk about a couple of Big East matchups. Clemson at South Carolina. Again, another game, regional matchup there, SEC, ACC. Obviously, Clemson was the only team in that challenge that managed to beat an SEC team. Do you expect them to get another win over an SEC team, even though it's a true road game for Clemson going on the road to take on South Carolina?
I think they're the better team, but a true road game against an SEC side, I don't have the expectation they win, but I do think that would go a long way. Even if South Carolina is one of the inferior teams in the SEC, all 16 SEC teams are top 68 in KenPom. So that's pretty absurd. I would say I'd expect Clemson to be slightly favored, but it's not a game I would touch personally.
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable for that game. I want to move on and talk about the 2 Big East matchups, which highlight the rest of Tuesday's slate. We got a surprising 8-2 DePaul team getting a crack at Rick Pitino and St. John's. We're going to break down that matchup, talk about a few others as well. All that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to tackle the NFL action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5, and if you win, you'll get $150 in bonus bets. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you're going to hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. One of the games we're about to talk about, Kansas State, 2.5-point favorites over Drake tonight. Bulldogs are undefeated, could absolutely spoil the fun for Jerome Tang and the Wildcats. That might be a fun one to toss some money down and get on the TV. If you're interested in that game or any of the other lines for Tuesday night's contest, visit FanDuel.com to join today. As a reminder, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. It's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch, and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Today's episode is also brought to you by Prize Picks. Folks, make your holidays bigger and brighter with Prize Picks, the best place to get real money action while watching your favorite sports. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app. And folks, join now because this holiday season, Prize Picks is giving away 2 free picks in December, and they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Pixmas. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. All right, folks, Andy Patton, Leaf Thulin here, Locked On College Basketball Podcast, getting you ready for a fun slate of Tuesday evening games. We talked North Carolina, Florida, which is the big one. We also talked a little bit Clemson, South Carolina, and George Mason at Duke. Now we got a couple more games to talk about here. 2 of them taking place in the Big East. DePaul goes on the road to face the St. John's Red Storm at Carnesecca Arena. That game is at 6:30 Eastern time on Peacock. FanDuel favors the Johnnies by 13.5. Also, we got Seton Hall on the road at Villanova, 7:30 p.m., also on Peacock. There's no FanDuel line for that one, but KenPom is projecting Villanova to win that one by 11. Leaf, pair of Big East games. Not exactly the most exciting Big East matchups that we can have. I think that's a reasonable thing to say, but what are you looking forward to with these 2 matchups on Tuesday night?
Well, I guess seeing how real Villanova is, because they've been playing significantly better since losing another Big 5 game where they lost within this the city of Philadelphia. And they've since beaten Cincinnati, who just beat Xavier, and Xavier, many, including myself, thought could finish top 3 in the Big East. So maybe they're decent. Eric Dixon's certainly one of the better players in college basketball. I'd make an argument he's at least a first or second team All-American. And I think that's where I'd look, because Seton Hall makes every game tough. I don't think they're very good, but they make every game difficult. And that's what I want to see, the ability to power through a difficult, contentious opponent in Seton Hall. So that one intrigues me more. I think St. John's will kind of roll over DePaul. And I'm sorry to DePaul, who started 8-2. That's great. But Providence is pretty terrible, in my opinion, this year. And Providence just went to Wintrust Arena and beat DePaul. So that one doesn't draw too much of my attention, but I'm enough of a basketball sicko. I may still watch it.
I think the Villanova side of things is interesting. Their resume is, they have that win over Cincinnati, who's at 23rd at KenPom right now. They have a win over Temple, who's 118th at KenPom right now. All their other wins are over teams that are outside the top 250. So they really haven't beaten anybody good. Pretty much outside of Cincinnati.
Maryland.
What's that?
They should have beaten Maryland.
They should have beaten Maryland.
Big what if right there.
Yeah, and that changes their resume dramatically, as Maryland's a top 20 team at KenPom, but they were not able to get that one done. This team hasn't proven much to me yet. And I think a win here over Seton Hall, again, it's like Seton Hall's a frustrating team because nobody's going to take, just on face value, nobody's going to take beating Seton Hall super seriously, especially a home game for Villanova. But beating Seton Hall is hard. Like it's hard to do just because of the style that they play. They're the last type of team that I think most teams want to play, because it's easy to envision losing to them just because of the style that they play, but they're not going to be very well respected as a win with they have lost to Monmouth. Like, this team has not been very good this year. So if Villanova wins, and if they win this one fairly handily, I think that does set them up well going forward, even if I think a lot of people won't view it as such. And I'm with you that St. John's probably rolls over DePaul, probably wins this one by 15-ish or more, especially at home. But Pitino, which this is the job of a coach, he was highly had a lot of praise for DePaul in a press conference earlier on Monday. He mentioned that he thinks they could finish top 5 in the Big East, which I think he's probably blowing a little extra smoke there for DePaul. But they do shoot really well from 3. They're 40% as a team from 3. They're top, I think they're 11th at KenPom right now in 3 points. So this is a good shooting team. They have talent. I like Chris Holtmann. I like the direction they're going. Do I think DePaul's a top 5 team in the Big East? No. Do I think they beat St. John's? No. But I think it's fun to see DePaul start to play more competitive games and just starting to get into action against Big East teams. I think it'll be fun to see how it goes. But I think ultimately the 2 home teams, the 2 favorite teams, probably get their wins here in Big East action.
Well, it'd be pretty darn ironic if they are a top 5 team in the Big East. The Big East is terrible then.
Yeah.
And so, like, his whole job is to lobby for the Big East, because the Big East only got 3 bids, and what a catastrophe, because he was left hanging on the bubble. Shaheen Hollow was left hanging on the bubble. And now I'm going to lobby for DePaul to be a top 5 in that like exclusively knocks all these teams out, because there is no way in the world, barring winning Big East tournament, that DePaul makes the tournament. So I think that's pretty ironic that he's lobbying for the Big East, and maybe I'll eat my own words and Holtman's really got something cooking, but I don't think so. So that gives me a chuckle. But you know, sometimes Christmas miracles do occur.
I am a believer in Chris Holtmann, just not yet. I think it might take another year or two, but I like that. I'm happy that this team is moving in the right direction. I just don't think that it's going to happen necessarily this year. A couple more games, Leaf. One of them we could just speed by. UNLV at Dayton, 7:00 Eastern time, CBS Sports Network. FanDuel favors Dayton by 11.5. I like that Dayton's got UNLV and Cincinnati this week. Tough schedule for Dayton. I think they've played a really competitive schedule at this point. They already have wins over UConn, Marquette, and Northwestern. That's incredible. They were a possession away from beating North Carolina. They were a couple possessions away from beating Iowa State. So this is a game that Dayton should roll, should beat UNLV, but I wanted to give a shout out to the Flyers for their non-conference slate. And then our last game here, Drake taking on Kansas State, 8 p.m. Eastern time at the T-Mobile Center in Kansas City. Game is on ESPN+. FanDuel only favors the Wildcats by 2.5, and that's because Drake, they're really good. They're one of the best mid-major teams in college basketball. Kansas State's been reeling a little bit. Chor is no longer with the team. He didn't start the season with them. He played sparingly in his games as a transfer that was expected to have a much bigger role for this team. Coleman Hawkins, another transfer addition who hasn't really looked like himself. He's not scoring very much. He's distributing the ball okay, but this Kansas State team's been a little bit of a mess. They've been a little bit all over the place. I would not be surprised at all if they take a loss to a Drake team that is much more polished and put together, despite a new coach, despite a very new look roster for them. They just seem to be playing some really good ball, and Kansas State, I don't think, is at their peak this season or anywhere close to it, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this one go in the direction of the Bulldogs.
I am right there with you, and I've actually got a pretty bold proclamation to declare right here. So I will circle. This is going to come for full circle. It may seem like it's going off the rails here. Start of the year, there were two teams that I said spent way too much money that I did not think made any sense in terms of their transfers. They both went front court heavy, and they both paid a lot of money. It was Kansas State and Indiana. Kansas State, Achor, David N'Guesson. I know he came back. Coleman Hawkins, and then you already had like diminutive guards, and you're trying to replicate the magic year of making the Elite Eight with Noel and all that. It just didn't make any sense, specifically because none of those guys are gifted scorers in front court. That team had Keontae Johnson. That team had just gritty guys surrounding the two stars. So they tried to pigeonhole something. Indiana, I've talked ad nauseum. I really hated their transfer portal because they got talented guards, but neither could shoot particularly well. They filled the team that's best player would have been Malik Renew scoring at the 5, make him play the 4. Mbako better at the 4, has to play the 3. Anyway, the reason I bring up Indiana because Drake's head coach, Ben McCollum, is the best head coach no one knows about, and he's going to the Indiana Hoosiers at the end of the year, and that's why it's full circle. I think Drake wins this game, and also Doug McDaniels, aside from the program right now as well. So I think Drake has the best guard in this game, and I wouldn't be surprised they have the best big either. So Drake won the Charleston Classic and won all of their games by double digits against teams like Miami, and they did it pretty easily against teams like VCU, who I think are pretty good. And then really quickly about the A-10, Dayton I ranked 15. You briefly asked about that in the first segment. I ranked them 15 because they were a couple possessions away from beating Iowa State, who I think we'd be talking about as the best team in the country had they held on to an 18-point lead against Auburn. So I have them ranked number 3. I think that's a great team. They almost beat them. They should have beaten North Carolina, and they got in a track meet with the only team that you don't really want to get in a track meet with at Maui. Like, you didn't want to get in that game. And then they beat UConn, who UConn just came in and beat some really good teams. And we can talk about the inconsistencies of UConn, but they're probably going to end up a top 10 team. And then they beat Marquette, who is ranked within the top 10. So I think Dayton is going to beat UNLV, and that might be a high-scoring game because UNLV doesn't play any defense but can really score. And then Cincinnati is the exact opposite. Cannot score, plays with a ton of defense. So if they show the diversity in ways they can win, and they already have their wins, don't be surprised if this Dayton team is a better seed than the 7 seed they were with Deron Holmes, who was a second-team All-American last year and made it to the second round.
This could be a big, huge week for Dayton if they win both these games. At that point, you got to start talking about them as a board. The AP is not going to have them in the top 10 if they win both these games, unfortunately. But I think you got to start at least considering them as a top 15 team. Certainly, I know you already have them there, and I think many people probably will have them there, especially with Cincinnati being a top 20 team right now. But this Dayton team is dangerous, and what a tremendous job by the staff to have this team playing this good of basketball in the post Deron Holmes era. That's a fun aside in the A10. I think we will have some larger conversations about the A10 at some point, getting closer to conference play, because that looks like a potential 2-3, maybe even bid league for a league that's historically been in that 2-3 bid conversation, but hasn't the last couple of years. This feels like a year where they could really kind of start pushing towards that again, and I think deservedly so. That's going to wrap it up for us today. Leaf, thanks so much for hopping on. As always, folks, thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Some fun basketball to watch. Again, based on these games, at least you got to have 4 or 5 different monitors going if you want to watch them all on Tuesday evening. But some fun stuff there. We'll recap these games, get you ready for the rest of the week on Wednesday and going forward. Just a week and a half or so till the holidays, and then we're going to get into conference play in earnest right after that. A lot of fun stuff coming your way, folks. Stick with us. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, peace out.